Part 1. The Alpha's perspective in the fall of the Hummer corporate office had turned from a steady, reassuring drone into a deafening countdown. I sat at my mahogany desk, staring at the quarterly ledger, though the numbers refused to make sense anymore. Red ink, endless, bleeding columns of red. For generations, my family's name had been synonymous with empire. We were the pinnacle of alpha dominance, wealthy, untouchable, and proud. Or at least we used to be. It didn't happen overnight, but looking back, the collapse felt like an avalanche. A few disastrous investments in the shipping sector, a couple of backstab partnerships, and suddenly the liquidity was gone. Creditors were circling like hawks, and the once open doors of our corporate allies were bolted shut. I rubbed my temples, letting out a heavy sigh as the scent of cedar and ozone, my own anxious alpha pheromones, clung to the heavy air of my office. Yesterday, I had personally driven to visit 3 separate conglomerates, families we had bailed out decades ago. People who had smiled, shaken my hand, and sworn eternal loyalty over expensive scotch. "I'm sorry, son," the CEO of Advanced Industries had told me, not even looking me in the eye. "The market is volatile. We just can't take that kind of risk right now." Risk? They called keeping a legendary family afloat a risk. By evening, the word was out. Our stocks plummeted another 12%. The board was in a panic. My father had locked himself in his study with a glass of whiskey he shouldn't have been drinking, and my mother was refusing to answer her phone. I was the one holding the pieces. Me, the one everyone always underestimated because I preferred a warm smile and a collaborative approach over boardroom bloodbaths. They thought because I was approachable, because I knew how to laugh and keep morale high, that I was weak. They didn't see the iron beneath the surface. They didn't see how hard I was fighting just to keep my family from hitting rock bottom. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from our chief financial officer. "Assets in Sector 4 frozen. We have 48 hours before the bank's forced liquidation." I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the leather chair. 48 hours. Every traditional avenue was exhausted. Every proud, wealthy friend had turned a cold shoulder. There was only one option left. One family wealthy enough, powerful enough, and terrified enough to pull us out of the grave. And they hated us. Part 2. The last hope and the condition 48 hours. That was the merciless ultimatum ticking down on my phone screen. My father was completely broken, sitting in the dark of his study, staring blankly at family portraits of a dynasty that was about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. My mother had finally stopped crying, replaced by a hollow, numb silence that was somehow worse. We had lost everything. Our pride, our status, and very soon, the roof over our heads. There was only one door left in the entire city that wasn't bolted shut against us. The headquarters of the Van Sterling conglomerate loomed before me like a monolith of glass and cold steel. This was the territory of the Sterling family, an elite, fiercely guarded Omega dynasty whose financial grip on the city was absolute. While my family had spent decades building a legacy on charm, networking, and public relations, the Sterlings built theirs on absolute control, unyielding silence, and ruthless business acumen. They were the last people on earth I wanted to ask for help, but desperation is a humbling master. When I stepped off the private elevator onto the top floor, the atmosphere was freezing. The scent in the air was crisp, sharp winter mint and biting frost, the distinct, intimidating pheromones of high-ranking Omega dominance. No one smiled here. Employees moved like ghosts, whispering and glancing sideways as I walked past the mahogany double doors of the executive suite. I was ushered inside not by an assistant, but by the biting chill of the room itself. Sitting behind a massive glass desk was the head of the Sterling family, flanked by legal counsel. But it wasn't the elder Sterling who spoke. It was his eldest son and successor, the man who now held my family's fate in the palm of his hand. He didn't look up immediately. He let me stand there, letting the oppressive silence stretch out like a physical weight. When he finally raised his head, his sharp, icy eyes locked onto mine. There was no warmth in them, no pity, and certainly no mercy. Just a cool, calculating assessment, as if he were inspecting a pest crawling across his pristine floor. "Julian," his voice was smooth, devoid of any inflection. "I wonder how long it would take before your proud family came crawling to my door." My jaw tightened, but I forced a calm, measured posture. I couldn't afford pride right now. The market fluctuations hit us hard. I began, keeping my voice steady. "We are seeking a liquidity injection to restructure our debt. Your family has the capital, and we have the assets to what?" He cut me off smoothly, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers together. "To promise a return you can no longer guarantee? Your company is a sinking ship, Julian. Every bank in the city has blacklisted you. Why on earth would I throw a lifeline to a corpse?" Because I stepped closer, placing my hands flat on his desk, letting a faint trace of my alpha presence push back against his chill. "Our infrastructure, our patents, and our land holdings still hold billions in value. With your backing, we can bounce back within 2 years. We can be partners." The Omega let out a cold, humorless chuckle. He stood up, towering slightly despite being an Omega, his presence commanding the entire room. He walked slowly around the desk until he was standing just inches away from me. The mint scent of his pheromones grew sharper, laced with absolute authority. "Partnership implies equality," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. "And right now, you are in no position to be anyone's partner. You are a beggar. He turned his back, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering skyline below. For a long, agonizing moment, the office was dead silent. I braced myself for rejection, ready to watch everything my ancestors built crumble into dust. Then, he turned back around, a dangerous, calculating glint in his eye. "There's a way out," he said softly. "A bailout that clears every single one of your debts, keeps your parents out of bankruptcy court, and leaves your corporate name intact." My chest tightened with a dangerous flicker of hope. "Name your terms." "Anything." The Omega walked right up to me, his gaze piercing straight through my defenses. "I don't want your assets." "I want you," he stated flatly. "You want my financial salvation? Then your family's price of admission is a contract. You will marry me." Part 3. The contract marriage, the words hung in the air like falling glass. "Marry me." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a cruel joke, a twitch of a smirk, or a hint of amusement. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding resolve. "Marriage." I managed to choke out, the word tasting like ash on my tongue. "You want to leverage our bankruptcy to trap me in a wedding?" "It's not a trap, Julian. It's a transaction," he replied smoothly, walking back to his desk and picking up a thick, leather-bound document. He slid it across the glass surface toward me. "Your family keeps everything. The holdings, the name, the status. In exchange, you become legally bound to the Sterling family name for a minimum of 3 years. A contract marriage. Clean, binding, and absolute." I looked down at the contract. Every page was filled with clauses, stipulations, and ironclad legal safeguards designed to protect his interests while reducing my existence to a signature. My mind raced. My father's health was failing. If the bank seized our assets tomorrow, it would literally kill him. My mother would be cast out of society she had lived in her entire life. And me? I was being traded off like a corporate asset to satisfy the bruised pride or calculated ambitions of the city's most untouchable Omega. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice dropping an octave as a dark, suppressed wave of alpha frustration rolled off me. The Omega didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply met my gaze with that same freezing composure. "Then by tomorrow morning, foreclosure notices will be plastered across every single one of your family's properties. You'll be bankrupt, disgraced, and homeless within a week. The choice is yours." There was no choice. We both knew it. With trembling fingers, I picked up the heavy metallic pen resting beside the contract. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. I flipped to the final page, where a blank line waited for my signature, like a trapdoor springing open. I didn't hesitate anymore. I signed my name in sharp, decisive strokes, sealing my fate and binding my life to a man who looked at me not with love or warmth, but like a prize won in a hostile takeover. The wedding was thrown together with terrifying speed, executed with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger rather than a celebration of union. There were no grand romantic gestures, no glowing family gatherings filled with joy. It was a private, heavily guarded civil ceremony attended only by a handful of mandatory legal witnesses and our respective lawyers. I stood at the altar in a tailored charcoal suit, feeling like a ghost in my own body. When he walked down the aisle, dressed in a sharp, pristine white suit that contrasted sharply with his dark hair and freezing aura, the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. His scent, sharp winter mint and crisp frost, flooded the space, pushing against my own warm cedar pheromones in a silent display of dominance. We exchanged rings that felt heavier than lead. When the officiant instructed us to seal the vows, he leaned in, his lips brushed against my cheek for a fraction of a second, dry, devoid of emotion, and entirely clinical. By nightfall, I wasn't driven back to my family's historic estate. Instead, my luggage was loaded into the back of a sleek black town car and brought straight to a sprawling, ultramodern penthouse overlooking the heart of the city. Walking through the grand double doors of his home felt less like entering a house and more like checking into a high-security prison. The interior was minimalist, painted in stark shades of gray, white, and black, devoid of any personal warmth or lived-in comfort. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, tossing it onto a designer chair without looking at me. "Your room is down the hall to the left," he said flatly, unlacing his cuffs. "The master suite remains mine. We maintain appearances in public, Julian, but behind closed doors, we live separate lives. Don't touch my things, don't disrupt my schedule, and don't expect a husband. You're here because you had to be. Act like it." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked down the opposite corridor, leaving me standing alone in the cavernous, freezing silence of a marriage built entirely on debt. Part 3. The contract marriage, the words hung in the air like falling glass. "Marry me." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a cruel joke, a twitch of smirk, or a hint of amusement. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding resolve. "Marriage." I managed to choke out, the word tasting like ash on my tongue. "You want to leverage our bankruptcy to trap me in a wedding?" "It's not a trap, Julian. It's a transaction," he replied smoothly, walking back to his desk and picking up a thick, leather-bound document. He slid it across the glass surface toward me. "Your family keeps everything. The holdings, the name, the status. In exchange, you become legally bound to the Sterling family name for a minimum of 3 years. A contract marriage. Clean, binding, and absolute." I looked down at the contract. Every page was filled with clauses, stipulations, and ironclad legal safeguards designed to protect his interests, while reducing my existence to a signature. My mind raced. My father's health was failing. If the bank seized our assets tomorrow, it would literally kill him. My mother would be cast out of society she had lived in her entire life. And me? I was being traded off like a corporate asset to satisfy the bruised pride or calculated ambitions of the city's most untouchable omega. And if I refuse? I asked, my voice dropping an octave as a dark, suppressed wave of alpha frustration rolled off me. The omega didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply met my gaze with that same freezing composure. Then by tomorrow morning, foreclosure notices will be plastered across every single one of your family's properties. You'll be bankrupt, disgraced, and homeless within a week. The choice is yours. There was no choice. We both knew it. With trembling fingers, I picked up the heavy metallic pen resting beside the contract. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. I flipped to the final page, where a blank line waited for my signature, like a trapdoor springing open. I didn't hesitate anymore. I signed my name in sharp, decisive strokes, sealing my fate and binding my life to a man who looked at me not with love or warmth, but like a prize won in a hostile takeover. The wedding was thrown together with terrifying speed, executed with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger rather than a celebration of union. There were no grand romantic gestures, no glowing family gatherings filled with joy. It was a private, heavily guarded civil ceremony attended only by a handful of mandatory legal witnesses and our respective lawyers. I stood at the altar in a tailored charcoal suit, feeling like a ghost in my own body. When he walked down the aisle, dressed in a sharp, pristine white suit that contrasted sharply with his dark hair and freezing aura, the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. His scent, sharp winter mint and crisp frost, flooded the space, pushing against my own warm cedar pheromones in a silent display of dominance. We exchanged rings that felt heavier than lead. When the officiant instructed us to seal the vows, he leaned in, his lips brushed against my cheek for a fraction of a second, dry, devoid of emotion, and entirely clinical. By nightfall, I wasn't driven back to my family's historic estate. Instead, my luggage was loaded into the back of a sleek black town car and brought straight to his sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse overlooking the heart of the city. Walking through the grand double doors of his home felt less like entering a house and more like checking into a high-security prison. The interior was minimalist, painted in stark shades of gray, white, and black, devoid of any personal warmth or lived-in comfort. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, tossing it onto a designer chair, without looking at me. "Your room is down the hall to the left," he said flatly, unlacing his cuffs. "The master suite remains mine. We maintain appearances in public, Julian, but behind closed doors, we live separate lives. Don't touch my things, don't disrupt my schedule, and don't expect a husband. You're here because you had to be. Act like it," without waiting for a response. He turned and walked down the opposite corridor, leaving me standing alone in the cavernous, freezing silence of marriage built entirely on debt. Part 4. Life together and character contrast living under the same roof as an ice statue turned out to be every bit as exhausting as I'd feared, but adapting to it required a completely different kind of survival instinct. Back in the days before the crash, before my family name was reduced to a footnote in financial bailout reports, I was known for being lively. I liked a loud breakfast table. I liked cracking jokes with my team, walking into a room with a warm smile, and making sure the people around me felt at ease. Even now, despite the crushing weight of the contract marriage hanging over my head, my natural disposition couldn't just be switched off like a light bulb. That was the fundamental clash between us. He was a creature of absolute order, silence, and glacial control. I was a creature of warmth, motion, and stubborn, lingering affection, even when that affection was completely uninvited. Take our mornings, for instance. By the second week, I had settled into a routine. I would wake up early, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toasted brioche filling the sterile, minimalist kitchen of the penthouse. Back at my family estate, mornings were a social event. Here, it was like dining in a mausoleum, until I accidentally shattered the quiet. The first time I tried to talk to him over breakfast, he didn't even look up from his tablet. "Good morning," I said cheerfully, sliding a ceramic mug of black coffee toward the side of the marble island. "Slept okay?" His eyes flicked up from the screen, landing on the coffee cup as if it were a biohazard before rising to meet my face. "I don't drink coffee brewed by anyone else, Julian, and I prefer my mornings quiet." "Right. My apologies, Your Highness," I muttered, flashing a wry, teasing grin that didn't reach my eyes. Forgot I was sharing space with a corporate cyborg. His jaw tightened, a flash of irritation crossing his cold features. "Save your charm for the boardrooms. It doesn't work on me." "Oh, come on. A little sunshine won't kill you," I retorted, leaning against the counter, my natural clinginess kicking in just to poke the bear. "We're legally bound for 3 years, remember? At least learn how to say good morning before you foreclose on my sanity." He stood up so abruptly his designer chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. Without a single word, he picked up his briefcase, threw his coat over his arm, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing alone with a cooling cup of coffee and a lingering trace of bitter winter mint in the air. Yet, for all his walls, he couldn't completely escape me, and neither could I escape him. Despite his warnings not to disrupt his schedule, my habits were hard to break. When midday rolled around and the stress of trying to salvage what was left of my family's remaining advisory firm got to be too much, I would find myself grabbing a takeout bag from his favorite downtown artisanal bistro, calling a car, and heading straight to the Van Sterling headquarters. The first time I bypassed his executive assistant and walked right into his office unannounced. He looked ready to fire the entire security detail. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, looking up from a stack of blueprints spread across his desk. "Bringing you lunch," I said brightly, kicking the door shut behind me and walking straight over to his desk. I unboxed a steaming plate of his favorite saffron-infused risotto and set it right on top of his critical financial reports. "You skipped breakfast because you were running away from my sparkling personality. You can't skip lunch, or you'll turn into an even bigger ghost than you already are. Julian, this is a professional workplace." "I am not your project," he said, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, as if a migraine were forming behind his eyes. But he didn't push the plate away. "I know it's a workplace," I replied softly, pulling up a chair and sitting down right across from him, resting my chin on my hands with a playful, persistent grin. "And I'm your husband, technically speaking. Nagging you is in my job description now." He stared at me for a long, silent moment, looking like a man trying to solve an equation that had no logical answer. Then, with a quiet, defeated sigh, he picked up his fork. We fell into a strange, twisted rhythm over the next few months. He remained cold, distant, and fiercely protective of his personal space, working long hours in his office, and treating our marriage like a business liability. But I kept showing up. I kept filling the silent corners of his life with my stubborn warmth, breaking past his restrictions just enough to make him react. We were oil and water, ice and fire, bound together by a signature and a debt. Neither of us knew that a storm was brewing on the horizon, one that would shatter the fragile, icy truce we had built. Part 5. The girl's return and the spark of jealousy months had passed since our forced wedding, and our daily routine had settled into a fragile, unpredictable rhythm. He was still the cold, distant executive buried in his corporate fortress, and I was still the stubbornly persistent, bubbly husband who crashed his office for lunch and forced him to interact with the real world. Or so I thought. The disruption didn't come from a market crash or a hostile takeover. It walked right through the double doors of our favorite downtown lounge, laughing loudly, wrapped in designer silk, and smelling faintly of expensive jasmine and old money. Her name was Celeste. Long before my family went bankrupt, long before the Sterling family forced me into a contract marriage, Celeste had been a permanent fixture in high society circles. She had harbored a fiercely vocal, unabashed crush on me for years, chasing after me at every gala and charity auction. Just before my family's financial collapse, she had traveled abroad to manage her family's international assets in Europe. Now she was back, and she had zero intention of letting a little thing like my marriage stand in her way. I was sitting at a corner table of the lounge, waiting for my husband to finish a late meeting, so we could head home, when Celeste spotted me. Before I could even blink, she slid into the booth right across from me, her eyes sparkling with unadulterated triumph. "Julian, darling, look at you," she purred, leaning forward and placing a manicured hand right over mine. "I heard the most devastating rumors about your family's company, but seeing you here, you look just as breathtaking as the day I left." I gently pulled my hand back, offering a polite, lukewarm smile. "Hello, Celeste. Welcome back. I trust your time abroad was productive." "Oh, it was fine. All I could think about was coming back home to the people I missed," she laughed, her gaze tracing over my features with an intense familiarity that made the back of my neck prickle. "And imagine my absolute shock when I heard you tied the knot. An arranged marriage to the notoriously frozen heir of the Sterling Empire? Please, everyone knows it's just a business transaction, Julian. You don't have to pretend you're happily domestic with an ice cube." Before I could formulate a sharp comeback, a cold, razor-sharp voice sliced through the ambient noise of the lounge. "Is there a problem here?" We both looked up. My husband had arrived. He stood at the edge of the booth, his silver-trimmed suit looking immaculate, his expression carved out of pure glacier ice. The air around him dropped 10 degrees instantly, his winter mint pheromones flaring up in protective, territorial surge that clashed violently with the sweet jasmine in the air. Celeste didn't even flinch. She simply tilted her head, batting her eyelashes with performative innocence. "Oh, you must be the infamous husband. I'm Celeste, an old, very close friend of Julian's. I was just welcoming him back to the social scene, since it's so painfully obvious he's been cooped up like a bird in a gilded cage." My husband's eyes shifted from Celeste to me. His gaze wasn't warm. It never was. But there was a strange, unreadable sharpness in his dark eyes, a flicker of something dangerously possessive that he quickly masked beneath a wall of absolute indifference. "My husband's social calendar is fully managed," he said smoothly, his voice dangerously low, "and our private life is none of your concern. If you'll excuse us, we are leaving." He didn't wait for Celeste to reply. He grabbed my elbow, not roughly, but with a firm, inescapable grip, and hauled me up out of the booth. He led me out into the cool night air, without saying a single word, shoving me gently into the passenger seat of his town car before slamming the door shut. As he slid into the driver's seat and pulled out into traffic, the silence inside the car was suffocating. I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. "Well," I said, breaking the quiet with a nervous, defensive edge as my own alpha pride flared up, "you certainly know how to make a girl feel welcome." "Save it, Julian," he snapped, his eyes glued to the road ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. If you're going to fraternize with women from your past who clearly disrespect our arrangement, at least have the decency to do it somewhere I don't have to clean up your mess. My chest tightened, a dangerous spike of hot anger overriding every ounce of patience I had built over the last 6 months. Clean up my mess? After everything I had sacrificed, after giving up my freedom, my family's legacy, and my pride just to keep us afloat, he still viewed me as a liability. My mess? I echoed, my voice rising sharply in the confined space of the car. I didn't invite her over, and I certainly don't need your permission to breathe. Maybe if you weren't such a cold, distant ghost of a husband, I wouldn't have been sitting there alone in the first place. He hit the brakes at a red light. So hard the car jerked forward. He turned his head, his icy glare colliding directly with mine, a furious storm brewing behind his cold facade. And that was when a fragile truce shattered completely. Part 6. The argument and the threat of divorce. Say that again, he whispered, his voice dropping into a lethal, glacial register that should have made me back down. Instead, it only poured gasoline on the fire. Months of bottled up frustration, humiliation, the crushing weight of the contract marriage, and the constant sting of his emotional unavailability exploded all at once. I said, "You're a ghost." I fired back, my alpha pheromones surging, filling the car with a heavy, agitated scent of cedar and ozone that clashed violently with his freezing winter mint. I gave up everything for you. I signed away my life, my freedom, and my future just to save my family from ruin. And what do I get? You treat me like an unwanted piece of furniture in your penthouse. You lock me out, you shut me down, and the second someone from my past actually looks at me, you act like I committed a crime. I act like you have no self-preservation, he shouted back, finally snapping. The mask of absolute control shattered, revealing the raw, furious storm beneath. You think I like this arrangement? You think I enjoy having a bubbly, clinging nuisance force his way into my life and disrupt every boundary I've ever set? Then why did you marry me? I yelled, the tears of sheer anger stinging the backs of my eyes. If I'm such a nuisance, why trap me? Why not let my family sink instead of turning me into your trophy prisoner? Because, he roared, slamming his hand against the steering wheel, making the horn blare briefly in the empty street. He turned to me, his chest heaving, his dark eyes burning with an intensity one had never seen before. Because the moment I saw your family circling the drain, the thought of you losing everything, of you being broken down by the streets, drove me insane. I tied you to me because it was the only way to keep you safe. The confession hung in the suffocating air of the car, heavy and absolute. For a second, the world seemed to stop spinning. He stared at me, looking shocked at his own admission, as if he revealed a secret he had sworn to take to his grave. My breath hitched, my anger momentarily faltering under the weight of his words. But the damage was already done. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, twisting every emotion into razor-sharp barbs. Safe. I let out a harsh, broken laugh, shaking my head as I looked away from him. You call this safe? Living like a stranger in my own home, walking on eggshells around a man who won't even look me in the eye unless there's a camera or a contract involved. He pulled back, his face instantly hardening again as he tried to rebuild his shattered walls. If you hate it here so much, Julian, if my presence is truly that unbearable to you. He paused, his voice turning ice cold. Then maybe we should end it. The word dropped into the car like a bomb. End it. Divorce. I whispered, the word tasting like poison. File the papers, he snapped coldly, turning his face back toward the windshield as the traffic light finally turned green. If you think you're so miserable, if you think you'd be better off crawling back to your broken family with nothing, then go ahead. I'll void the financial penalties. You can walk away. Fine, I screamed, the absolute fury overriding any lingering shred of sense. Consider the marriage over. I never wanted this damn contract anyway. He didn't say another word for the rest of the drive. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak, and when we reached the penthouse, he didn't even wait for me. He unlocked the door, walked straight down his corridor, and slammed his bedroom door shut. The silence that followed was deafening. The war lines had been drawn, the ultimate threat had been spoken aloud, and the fragile bridge between us had been burned to ash. Part 7. The alpha's coldness, the apology, and reconciliation the week that followed the argument was absolute torture. The explosive fight in the car had blown our fragile world to pieces, and the aftermath was suffocating. We were living under the same roof, but we operated like ghosts haunting the same hallways. We didn't speak. We didn't look at each other. And for the first time since our marriage began, I was the one pulling away completely. True to my word, I stopped. I stopped waiting up for him on the sofa, watching the clock tick past midnight, while listening for the click of his private elevator. I stopped lingering in the kitchen, hoping for a casual glance or a stray word over morning coffee. Most importantly, I stopped going to his office. No more unannounced visits. No more takeout lunches from his favorite downtown bistro brought straight to his desk. No more playful, teasing, nagging designed to break through his icy exterior. I cut off all communication completely. When we crossed paths in the expansive, minimalist hallways of the penthouse, my answers to his rare, clipped questions were monosyllabic, hollow, and entirely devoid of warmth. I gave him the exact cold shoulder he claimed to want. By the third day, the silence in the apartment felt heavy and oppressive. My natural scent, warm cedar and ozone, had completely faded from the shared spaces, replaced by a stagnant, tense emptiness. I spent my days locked in the guest room I had barely used since the wedding, scrolling mindlessly on my phone or staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering city below. By the 5th day, the toll of the silence began to weigh heavily on my own chest. Every instinct in my alpha nature screamed at me to fix it, to go into his study, flash a bright smile, and sweep the argument under the rug like we always did. But pride, cold, sharp, and stubborn, held me back. He had told me to file for divorce. He had told me I was a nuisance. If he wanted things to change, for once in his life, he was going to have to make the first move. By the 10th day, the atmosphere in the penthouse had grown so dense that even the air felt dead. It was late, somewhere around midnight, when the breaking point finally arrived. I was sitting alone on the living room sofa, the television playing silently with the brightness turned all the way down, casting eerie blue shadows across the dark room. Then I heard it. Heavy, uncharacteristic footsteps approaching down the main corridor. I didn't turn around. I figured he was just grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen before retreating back to his isolated master suite. Instead, the footsteps stopped dead in their tracks right behind the couch. A heavy, suffocating wave of winter mint rolled over me, but it wasn't the sharp, defensive, icy blast I'd grown used to. It was restless, agitated, fractured, and thick with a raw, undeniable vulnerability that made my breath catch in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head and looked up. He looked terrible. The immaculate, untouchable corporate titan was completely dismantled. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration for hours. His designer tie was gone, tossed aside somewhere, and the top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, exposing the tight pulse pounding rapidly at the base of his throat. He stood there in the dim light, his chest rising and falling heavily. For a proud, powerful Omega who commanded boardrooms and terrified seasoned executives, what he was about to do took every single ounce of courage he possessed. He looked stripped raw, exposed, and utterly terrified. I can't do this anymore, he finally choked out, his voice rough, thick, and completely stripped of all its usual icy polish. I blinked, my heart skipping a frantic beat against my ribs as I stared up at him from the couch. Do what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, keeping my guard up. File for divorce? Go ahead. The papers are still sitting right there on the desk where you left them. No, he snapped softly, his voice cracking slightly on the syllable. He took a sudden, desperate step forward, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides, as if he were fighting a physical weight. He closed his eyes tightly for a second, swallowing his immense pride, before forcing his dark eyes to lock directly onto mine. Not the divorce. I can't do the silence. He let out a shaky, jagged breath, running a hand over his face before dropping his gaze to the floor, unable to maintain eye contact for a moment before forcing himself to look back up. I tried, he continued, the words tumbling out of him in a rush, as if a dam had finally broken. I tried to convince myself that this was better, that having the apartment quiet, having my schedule uninterrupted, having my personal space back was what I wanted. But I was lying to myself, Julian. My throat felt tight. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, listening to the man who had treated me like a corporate liability for months bare his absolute soul. I can't do the empty office, he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw, broken murmur. I sat at my desk yesterday waiting for the elevator doors to open, expecting you to walk in with takeout and that annoying, brilliant smile. When you didn't, the office felt like a tomb. I can't live in a house where you look right through me. I can't live a life where you aren't there. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the faint hum of the city lights outside. He took another step closer, closing the final distance between us, and dropped heavily to his knees right in front of the sofa, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered desperation. I'm sorry, he whispered, the foreign words tasting heavy and agonizing on his tongue. I was a coward, Julian. I pushed you away because I was terrified. Terrified of how much control you had over me, how easily you broke through every single wall I spent a lifetime building. When Celeste showed up, I lashed out like a fool because I was jealous. Green, blindingly jealous. I couldn't stand the thought of anyone else looking at you, touching you, or even breathing the same air as you because you belonged to me, and I was too proud to admit it. The anger, the resentment, the bitter, freezing ice of the past 2 weeks melted away instantly, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of warmth that flooded my chest. Before he could say another word, before he could overthink his confession or try to rebuild his armor, I moved. I stood up from the couch, pulling him up with me, and threw my arms tightly around his neck. I buried my face straight into his shoulder, breathing in his winter mint scent as it finally softened into something safe, warm, and entirely grounding. For a split second, he stiffened out a pure, lifelong instinct. Then, with a shuddering, ragged gasp, his strong arms wrapped fiercely around my waist. He hauled me flush against his chest, holding onto me so tightly and desperately as if he were terrified that if he loosened his grip even a fraction, I would vanish in thin air like a dream. You are such an absolute idiot, you know that? I murmured against his collarbone, a wet, watery laugh escaping my lips as tears finally spilled over my eyelashes. Yeah, he whispered back, his voice trembling slightly as his lips pressed soft, lingering kisses into my hair, holding me closer than he ever had in the entire history of our marriage. I am, but I'm never letting you go, and you are never, ever stopping those office visits. Do you hear me? We'll see about that. I smiled softly against his skin, though my arms tightened just as fiercely around his back, refusing to let him go either. The war was over. The ice had melted away completely, and in the warm, quiet embrace of the penthouse, we weren't two strangers trapped by a cold financial contract anymore. We were just us, finally, truly, husband and husband. Part 8 and Epilogue. The next generation to transition from the bitter cold of our silent war to genuine, unconditional warmth didn't happen overnight, but once the ice broke, it dissolved completely. Life inside the penthouse shifted in subtle, beautiful ways. The stark, minimalist white and gray surfaces began to accumulate the messy, chaotic proof of life actually being lived. Books we were both reading sat haphazardly on the coffee table. A ridiculously bright, soft blue throw blanket, chosen entirely because it clashed with his rigid interior design aesthetic and made him playfully narrow his eyes, was permanently draped over the sofa. The heavy, oppressive quiet of the hallways was replaced by the constant, reassuring echo of my footsteps, my voice, and a lingering presence of my warm cedar and ozone pheromones blending effortlessly with his sharp winter mint. He still went to his downtown corporate tower every single morning. Of course, he was still the formidable, razor-sharp titan of industry that the city's business elite both revered and feared. But the heavy, impenetrable armor he used to wear like a second skin, that stayed at the office. The moment he stepped through our front door at the end of the day, he was simply my husband. And true to form, I never stopped showing up unannounced with lunch. I'd bypass his executive assistant, who had long since given up trying to stop me, walk straight into his private office without knocking, and drop a warm, aromatic meal right on top of his critical financial reports. Every single time, he would look up, pinch the bridge of his nose with a theatrical sigh, and mutter something about professional boundaries. But the tiny, fond twitch at the corner of his lips always betrayed him. He never once complained about it again. In fact, if my schedule ever ran late and I missed our usual midday routine, my phone would invariably buzz within 10 minutes with a short, demanding text message. Where are you? Come home. We had found our rhythm. A rhythm built not on a suffocating legal contract or mutual desperation, but on the stubborn, persistent warmth of two completely different souls learning how to fit together. The revelation things shifted into an entirely new dimension a few months later. It started with small, uncharacteristic things. A sudden, overwhelming wave of morning exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. A strange sensitivity to certain sharp smells, and a lingering radiant sweetness that began to weave itself into his usually crisp winter mint pheromones, wrapping around me like a cozy blanket whenever he held me close. One evening, while we were sitting quietly on the living room sofa, he suddenly stopped reading his tablet, his dark eyes narrowing as he stared at me with intense, analytical focus. You've been pale for 3 days, he stated, his voice laced with sudden protective alpha anxiety. And you fell asleep against my shoulder during dinner last night. We are calling the family physician. I'm fine, you worrywart. I laughed, waving a hand dismissively. Just a bit stressed with no argument. He cut me off smoothly, already picking up his phone. By the following afternoon, our private family physician was packing up his diagnostic kit in our living room, a wide, knowing smile spread across his face. When the doctor confirmed the news that the cold, untouchable Omega executive was carrying our child, the stoic, unshakable man completely lost his composure. For the first time in the entire history of our relationship, he was utterly, breathtakingly speechless. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, brilliant flush, and tears welled up in his dark eyes. Before the doctor could even finish packing his instruments, my husband stood up, crossed the room in 2 long strides, and pulled me into an embrace so fierce, so tight, and so overwhelmingly protective that I couldn't even draw a full breath. He buried his face deep into my neck, his shoulders trembling slightly as endless, broken words of gratitude and raw emotion spilled out against my skin. The cold corporate titan had completely melted away, leaving only a man holding on to his entire world. Epilogue. The next generation years later, the penthouse was louder, brighter, and wonderfully, beautifully chaotic. The corporate empire was more secure and successful than it had ever been, but neither of us cared much about boardroom glamour or status when we were safely home behind our own heavy double doors. I stood in the center of the expansive kitchen, laughing out loud as a pair of tiny, energetic arms wrapped tightly and possessively around my right leg. Down on the floor, our 4-year-old son, who possessed his father's striking dark hair, sharp features, and intense, piercing gaze, but inherited my relentlessly bubbly, affectionate, and utterly clingy disposition, was chattering a mile a minute about a plastic spaceship he had just crashed into the kitchen island. Daddy, look, the spaceship landed on Mars, he announced excitedly, tugging urgently on my trousers. Did it now? I chuckled, bending down to scoop him up, planting a loud, exaggerated kiss on his cheek that made him giggle uncontrollably. Well, Captain, I think Mars requires a landing snack before you explore any further. Heavy, familiar footsteps approached from the quiet hallway, and I looked up to see my husband walking into the kitchen. His designer tie was casually loosened around his collar, his crisp sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the strong lines of his skin. The years had only made him look more striking, but the perpetual frost that used to define him was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, quiet contentment. As he stepped closer, our son immediately reached out his little arms, abandoning my neck for his father's. My husband scooped the boy up with practiced, effortless ease, settling him securely against his hip. A soft, genuine smile touched his lips, a warm, unguarded, incredibly tender smile that he saved entirely and exclusively for the two of us. He walked the remaining steps toward me, pausing just inches away. With his free hand, he reached out, pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to my forehead before burying his face deep into the crook of my neck. He breathed in the deeply comforting scent of cedar, ozone, and home, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute peace. "You're spoiling him rotten, you know," he murmured against my skin, his deep voice rumbling softly, though he was smiling far too brightly to mean a single word of it. "Takes one to know one, darling." I teased back softly, wrapping my free arm around both of them, pulling my husband and our son flush against my chest. I looked around the warm, sunlit kitchen, thinking back to the cold boardroom where it had all started. The bankruptcy notices, the bitter threats, the icy contract marriage, the jealous tears, and the terrifying silence of our near divorce. It felt like a lifetime ago. We had started with nothing but a transaction. But looking at the life we had forged from the ashes, I wouldn't have changed a single second of the story. We had found our forever, and nothing in the world could ever freeze us out again.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to share and tell your friend about the channel. See you guys in the next video. Bye.